I was 13 when the Great Flood of 1947 hit Cawood. The first indication we had of danger was when water began to spout out of the river banks through rat holes and various other holes made by verming at that time. Of course, the banks in those days were not as substantial as they are today, and they were lower than they are today. I remember my father going down Cawood Ings to fetch a load of potatoes which had been riddled and placed into sacks at that time one Saturday afternoon, and he took with him Ernest Elcock, or Bosser as we used to call him, to load these potatoes. He was quite alarmed at the water coming through the bank sides, but however they got the potatoes and back home to Churchend Farm a short time before the great breach which happened along the river banks almost opposite Kelfield. I remember so clearly all this huge amount of water quickly filling up in the low-lying land in Cawood Ings, Cawood Marsh and to Wistow and beyond, of course. It was a terrible time for wildlife which had to seek refuge wherever it could. One place was just along the very top of the banks which still showed, and there were rabbits, weasels, rats of course, hares, anything that one would expect would die in water was there. And of course they survived in many of them. Unlike some of the poor hens we saw in hen houses which had been picked up by the flood and floated down the river. I remember hens looking out of the windows. They seemed to be quite unconcerned, but it was quite hilarious in a way. I suppose they would end up in some other person's backyard and probably drowned, I should think. Haystacks also were picked up by the floods and travelled several hundred yards or maybe half a mile or more and deposited elsewhere, ruined of course. Living in Churchend, which became marooned through the water which stretched from Yew Tree to the church, certainly to the church wall, meant that housewives who wanted to shop had to be taken by boat, which moored near the church wall. And as boys we used to jump into the boat and have a free ride to Yew Tree and back again on several occasions. Water also flooded into the churchyard. It filled the churchyard so full that it was to the top of the wall. The far end of the churchyard at that time had a substantial wall except for one missing brick. And through this hole in the wall, water poured out in a great, huge sort of chasm. And with other boys playing near Mr. Sykes's house, we were alarmed when there was a huge explosion, and thinking the banks had burst at that place, we began to run home. But what had happened was that the wall had exploded with the force of water. And very quickly, Churchend, from the church nearly to the hilltop to almost to Gould Bank, was flooded to a depth of, I should think, probably 3 feet. This, of course, gave boys an opportunity to play with rafts. I remember my father made a raft for us out of an old barn door and several oil drums, empty oil drums, of course, to give it buoyancy. And we paddled up and down there, my brother and Cecil and probably one or two others who I can't remember now, but we had a wonderful time doing this. It was all great fun to us and certainly not to my father and other farmers who had flooded fields, which was really quite a catastrophe in many cases. the land in Cawood Ings and Cawood Marsh, which was all very badly flooded, part of it was arable, certainly that near the river. To the left and to the right of Cawood Ings Road was arable land, as I remember it, growing cereals, potatoes certainly, and in the wartime flax. Flax was grown during the war as part of a scheme to provide materials for aircraft fuselages. But in Cawood Marsh, most of that land was down to grassland. And I remember it very well from wartime when a bomber from Rickle Airfield came down in that area, and it landed in some very wet, boggy grassland, and it created huge furrows from the wheels through 4 or 5 hedges and ditches and came to a standstill. No one was hurt in the plane, and as I remember, there was only one bent propeller there. So that gives me, my memory, an indication of what the land would be like in 1947, before a lot of the drainage schemes took place to alter that.